Numbers, games, survival. This boy from Durham was destined to turn every hand in life into his advantage. Frank Larry Matthews was born in 1944 in Durham, North Carolina, a town that smelled of tobacco and factory smoke. The South was hard for black families in those days. Every opportunity came with the reminder of what you were not allowed to be. His mother, Margaret Matthews, was a strong woman who worked long shifts in the fields and cleaned houses for white families. His father was barely present, drifting in and out of their lives until one day, he left and never came back. Frank was the oldest of 5 children, and from a young age, he carried himself like the man of the house. Neighbors remembered him as a boy who never laughed easily. He didn't fight unless pushed, but when he did, he always won. His teachers said he was bright, though he rarely spoke in class. He loved numbers, patterns, and the logic behind games of chance. It was a gift that would later define him. When his mother died, he was just 14. Her death changed everything. Without her, home became just another empty space. He ran with older boys, began hustling chickens from farms, and sold them to neighbors for quick money. When the police finally caught him, he was sent to a reform school. It was supposed to break him. Instead, it hardened him. At the reform school, Frank learned silence and patience. He watched, studied, and waited. When he was released, he knew one thing: he never wanted to be poor again. In the late 1950s, he boarded a bus heading north. Like many black men escaping the poverty of the South, he was chasing a dream that America rarely offered. He found himself in Philadelphia, a city alive with jazz, gambling, and opportunity. Philadelphia was a training ground. Frank started working small-time, carrying cash for gambling houses, managing the numbers racket, running errands for men twice his age. He didn't drink, didn't use drugs, and didn't waste time. He learned how the streets moved, who paid, who lied, who talked too much. His coolness under pressure drew attention. Older hustlers began trusting him with bigger roles. Soon, he was traveling between cities, making drops, counting money, memorizing routes. Every move was an education. By the early 1960s, Frank was ready for more. He left Philadelphia for Brooklyn, New York. Brooklyn was louder, faster, and more dangerous. It was there he opened a small barbershop, his first legitimate front. But behind the mirrors and laughter, business of another kind was happening. The barbershop became a meeting point for gamblers, bookies, and dealers. Frank used it to build connections, to understand who really controlled the flow of money and drugs. At the time, heroin dominated the streets, but access to it was controlled by the Italian Mafia. They held the ports, the suppliers, and the muscle. Every major dealer had to go through them. Frank decided he would not. He used his growing connections among Caribbean and Latin American suppliers to bypass the Mafia entirely. It was daring, it was genius, and it worked. Within a few years, Frank's network stretched from New York to Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and even as far as Atlanta. His organization moved quietly, efficiently. He built a structure that mimicked a corporation, with managers, distributors, and couriers who rarely knew one another. He taught them to handle business like professionals: no flashy talk, no unnecessary violence, and above all, no betrayal. They called him Black Caesar. The name began as a whisper and became legend. He was respected by allies and feared by rivals. His parties were extravagant, filled with models, musicians, and politicians. He wore silk suits, drove Rolls Royces, and lived in a mansion on Staten Island near Mafia bosses. But beneath the glamour was discipline. He didn't drink or use drugs. He ran his empire like an accountant, tracking every dollar. And yet, despite the fortune, he never forgot where he came from. He sent money back to Durham, helped local families, and occasionally appeared at community events to remind people he was still one of them. As the legend grew, so did the myths. Some said Frank buried gold in Carolina fields. Others claimed he kept ledgers filled with names of corrupt officers, judges, and politicians who were on his payroll. People whispered that he'd once met with leaders of the Nation of Islam, seeking guidance on how to build a self-sufficient black economy. No one could separate truth from story anymore. What was certain was that Frank Matthews had become the most powerful black drug lord in America. By the early 1970s, federal agents began closing in. The newly formed, saw him as the perfect trophy, a symbol of law enforcement's reach into organized crime. They followed his movements, tapped phones, and used informants. One of them was a trusted lieutenant who betrayed him for a lighter sentence. That betrayal opened the first crack in his empire. The FBI coordinated with state police to track his shipments. They traced money transfers, watched his lieutenants, and intercepted messages. They arrested couriers in Las Vegas and Baltimore. Each arrest brought them closer to the core. Still, Matthews stayed ahead. He used coded language, avoided phones, and never repeated a pattern. He was, as one agent later said, the smartest man we ever chased. But no man stays untouchable forever. In 1972, federal agents raided his properties, seized vehicles, and arrested dozens of his associates. Matthews himself was caught and charged with drug trafficking and tax evasion. His bail was set at $5 million, the highest in U.S. history at the time, and he paid it. He walked out of court calm, confident, and free, as if it was all part of a larger plan. Friends later said Frank looked tired in those last weeks. The pressure was mounting. Barbara Hinton, his companion, told a friend she was afraid the police would kill him. Yet he refused to run until he did. On July 2, 1973, the morning of his court appearance, Frank Matthews never arrived. By nightfall, the FBI was at his home. The place was empty, clothes gone, safes cleared, photos missing. Frank and Barbara had vanished completely. Rumors exploded. Some said he fled to Africa, using fake passports. Others believed he bribed his way out of the country with help from international connections. There were whispers he was seen in Venezuela, or living quietly in Lagos under a different name. No one ever proved a thing. The FBI continued searching for decades, following leads that went nowhere. To this day, his case remains open. For the people of Durham, Frank became something larger than life. Older men spoke of him as a folk hero who beat the system. Younger ones saw him as a warning about greed and ambition. His legend crossed into music, film, and literature. Rappers mentioned him in lyrics. Documentaries speculated about his fate. He became a ghost who refused to fade. Law enforcement still debates what happened. Some agents are convinced he was murdered by rivals or betrayed by his own people. Others believe he's alive, rich, and anonymous. In 2010, an aging retired agent said in an interview, "If Frank Matthews is alive, he's the only man who ever beat the game completely." The myths continue to grow. Stories claim he buried millions somewhere in the Carolinas, using gold coins and coded maps. Others say Barbara turned against him, taking the money and disappearing alone. Some believe the Mafia caught up with him and buried him in concrete. But no evidence ever surfaced. Every theory remains just that, a theory. What makes Frank Matthews' story unique is not just his disappearance, but his audacity. In a world dominated by organized crime families that excluded black men, he built his own kingdom. He proved he could match their discipline, intelligence, and power, and for a time, surpass them. He did it without permission, and that, perhaps, was his greatest crime. Today, his story is still told in whispers. Some call him a visionary, others a villain. To his family, he was both a son who never came home, a brother whose name they still cannot speak publicly. His siblings grew old in quiet lives, never confirming or denying what happened. The Matthews name became something both proud and cursed in Durham. In the end, Frank Matthews became exactly what he wanted to be: untouchable. Whether he lives under another name or rests in an unmarked grave, he remains an enigma, a man who built an empire, defied the Mafia, challenged the law, and vanished without a trace. Half a century later, his legend still breathes in every corner of black history, organized crime, and American folklore. The boy from North Carolina who outsmarted the system and disappeared into the wind is remembered by many names. Some call him a criminal, others a king. But to all, he remains the Black Caesar, the man who beat them all.